Does negativity get you down? Sometimes it can even derail our motivation and our best efforts. We're going to look at some techniques from early Buddhism that we can use to counteract negativity. Coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I put out new videos. And if you're interested in a deeper dive into elements of the Dharma of early Buddhism, check out my courses over on onlinedharma.org. There was a recent video out by Matt Diavella where he talks about negativity. And he talks about his own experiences with that. And mine are really roughly similar to his, which is why I wanted to make this video. But to begin with, when I talk about negativity, I'm not talking about constructive criticism, because I think sometimes we can confuse those two. Constructive criticism is really very different from negativity. Indeed, constructive criticism is great. If you're getting real constructive criticism, that can be a gift to you. It can teach you the way that you're doing things wrong so that you can make yourself better. A true friend is somebody who will give you constructive criticism. Now, they may give it to you in the wrong way. It may be hard to take sometimes. That can be often the case. It may even be misdirected. It may not be correct. In other words, somebody may be criticizing something constructively, which you have good reason to believe is not correct, but nevertheless, the intention behind it is good. And so, when I'm talking about negativity, I'm not talking about constructive criticism, because constructive criticism is intended to help. Negativity, on the other hand, is not. Negativity is really trying simply to knock you down. It's not criticizing in a way that you can actually get better with the criticism, but it's rather criticizing you in a way that's telling you basically to get lost. The internet is really, in many of its places, a den of negativity in this sense. Now, I'm lucky, I think, on this channel and this YouTube channel to have a really good audience. You all have been amazing at comments and questions, and indeed even constructive criticism, which is fine, which is great. But no place on the internet is 100%, and even here we do have our small group of malcontents, shall we say. What I would say is before I opened this channel, before I began this channel on YouTube, for over a decade, I helped run an online forum for open discussion. I was an administrator of that forum. And so during that time, during those many years, and indeed before that as well, I was made directly aware of what it was like to be in this kind of open discussion on the internet. And I have to say, it was really an eye-opener in many ways. But perhaps the biggest way I would say is that when I started my work on this online forum, this open forum for open discussion, my general approach had been to think that yes, of course, there were people who were going to disagree, and yes, there were going to be people who were somewhat, shall we say, difficult, but that everybody in time would come around to one degree or another. In other words, if we allowed for open discussion and open debate, and tried to tamp down all of our normal tendencies to yell and scream at each other, that people would eventually come to a kind of a general consensus on whatever the topic was. Which is not to say we would agree on everything, of course. We wouldn't necessarily agree, but at least we would sort of get to a place where we would agree to disagree, perhaps. But almost immediately, and more over time, I began to become aware that there was a significant minority of people on this open forum, and indeed in the internet generally, who were not there, let's say, to discuss in a way that would let them come to a more accurate understanding of whatever the topic was at hand, and that they weren't even there to criticize constructively in ways that might perhaps be in disagreement with the majority, but in any event trying to be constructive about it, but rather that there was this significant minority whose aim seemed to be rather just simply to disrupt online communities, to blow smoke, to make things more complicated, and they were basically what we would call trolls. And I think anybody who's been around the open internet and forums or discussion boards or comment sections will be familiar with the type. And so I began to realize slowly at first, but accelerating over the years, that there were this group of people who were there simply to be negative, simply to be disruptive. And that while it was tempting to engage with these people, this group of people, it was tempting to engage with them, the engagement simply went nowhere. And I became aware that the cliche "don't feed the trolls," that this statement that people make on the internet is indeed true. It's based in deep wisdom, that there is a group of people that simply there's no point engaging with, that the more you feed them, the more disruptive they become. And knowing that in the background, thinking of starting my own YouTube channel was, as Matt D'Avella says for himself, it was terrifying. It was very frightening to consider putting myself out there on YouTube, make videos regularly about topics, about anything, really, because there's no limit to where these disruptive people might show up. So, but whereas Matt D'Avella started as a professional filmmaker, somebody who really knew his craft, and so could bring it immediately to bear on YouTube, I knew nothing about filmmaking or audio or editing or anything. All I knew how to do really was set up a camera and talk for a little while. And so that was how I began. Now, in Matt's case, he says that what he found was the first video he released, being terrified, he realized that people were basically indifferent, that the response was largely a response of indifference. And my own case was very similar. Now, there was fortunately a number of people who did follow me at the beginning, because I saw I was posting around about it, and they showed up, and it was a positive for a small group of people. But basically, it was apart from that an example of indifference, just like Matt says. So I share a lot of his opinions about this, or at least I share a lot of the history here. Nevertheless, over the years that I've had this channel on, over the months and years here, there have been a number of people who were there, who have shown up in various forums or places criticizing. This is, of course, as I've already said, normal. This is the sort of thing that happens on the internet. And the Buddha talks, indeed, about this kind of thing way back 2,500 years ago. Indeed, one of the Buddha's most famous suttas, the Sutta on the Water Snake, is a discussion based around the question of why we learn the Dharma in the first place. And the Buddha talks about the Dharma being like a snake, where you can, if you grab it correctly, it can be very useful to you, but if you grab it incorrectly, it will turn around and bite you. And the way that the Buddha says that you can grab the Dharma incorrectly is to use it as an object of debate, to use it in order to defeat other people in various kinds of arguments and disputes and debates. This is an incorrect use of the Dharma, says the Buddha, because it makes it into an object of division between people. It makes it into something that becomes less useful to our daily practice and simply becomes an element of sort of boosting our own ego. Nevertheless, of course, debates and arguments will come. They came for the Buddha many, many times in the early suttas. So it's not that we have to avoid every argument, but it's rather that we shouldn't engage with this material in order to come into arguments with other people. So the Buddha talks about, in particular, how other people from other belief systems would come to argue with him, and in particular how they would misrepresent his views. At least they would pitch his viewpoint to him in ways that made it clear that they didn't understand really what he was saying. And the Buddhists, there are various different options we could take here. In the West, people tend to say that the best way out of this kind of situation is to improve our debating skills, is to come to a better understanding of the proper ways of debating other people in public, perhaps strategies and techniques, doing logical kinds of analyses of arguments, so that when we're in a debate with somebody, we can point out fallacies and so on. This is almost a kind of a way that people think of philosophical debate nowadays as sort of fallacy hunting and so on. But that's not the way the Buddha looked at it. Now, it's not to say that the Buddha had anything against those kinds of approaches, and indeed, the Buddha himself was interested in fallacious arguments and pointing out where people contradicted themselves and so on. But in the main, his approach was one of psychology, of emotion, of practicing with emotions, his own emotional attachment to the material at hand, rather than practicing with argument structures. So, for example, the Buddha says, if others abuse, attack, harass, and trouble you, don't make yourselves resentful, bitter, and emotionally exasperated. Or if others honor, respect, revere, or venerate you, don't make yourselves thrilled, elated, and emotionally excited. So how do we do this? Well, the Buddha recommends we practice with the idea of non-self. I did an earlier video on non-self, which I'll put up here on the screen in case you're interested in some of that history or some of what it is to be talking about non-self. But basically the idea is that we come to an awareness that there's no real permanent essence to who we are. And so when other people attack us, they're not really attacking us because there's nothing there that's permanent, essential, that they're pointing to. Everything is always in flux and change. And so what they're attacking is nothing that is solid in you. It's simply a concept that they have about you, a concept that you may share to your detriment, but you don't need to share. In other words, you don't need to buy into their view of you. You don't need to cling to any part of you. You don't need to cling to any concept of who you are. And so, to that extent, their arguments flow through you and simply touch on elements of whatever it is that's in discussion, which is something objective that you have no essential attachment to, or it's simply that they're mistaken, that they have, again, perhaps they're taking on a straw man. They're attacking something that you didn't even say or that nobody said. And these are ways that you can attempt to defuse the situation, at least emotionally within yourself. And the Buddha gives an example, a simile here. This comes in an example, I should say this comes in a case when the Buddha was talking with his monks in Jeta's grove, which is a large grove of trees. And the Buddha asks the monks, do you see around you all of these fallen leaves and branches and twigs? And the monks say yes. And he says, well, how would you feel if somebody came in, some group of people came in and took away gathered up all of these leaves and twigs and branches and carried them off somewhere and burned them? Would you feel concerned and afraid and angry? And the monks say no. And he says, of course, you would not, because they're not you. They're not who you are. They don't even belong to you. They're just a bunch of twigs and leaves and branches in the forest. In the same way, you should think of yourself in these kinds of situations. It's not you that's being attacked. It's simply leaves and branches and twigs. And so other people may harass and revile you in that sense. They may be very negative towards you. They may be trolling you, but they're not trolling who you really are. All they're doing is trolling ideas of you, things that really don't belong to you. That is to say that the argument that you're making doesn't belong to you. The Dharma doesn't belong to you. Your understanding of the Dharma doesn't belong to you. All of these things are simply features of the world. And people can criticize or not, as they wish, but it shouldn't reflect upon you, just as the trees around you, the leaves, the twigs, aren't you, they're not yours. So allow them to be carried off by others if others wish to carry them off. Now, this is a psychological kind of approach, but this is not to say that the Buddha was a bad debater. The Buddha had many debating techniques, which are really quite beautiful. For example, there's one other sutta where the Buddha is sitting, giving talks to his monastics, and a Brahmin enters, a man named Bharadvaja. And Bharadvaja is shall we say, a relatively powerful and arrogant Brahmin. And Bharadvaja is angry at the Buddha because the Buddha has recently ordained somebody from his clan. And the Brahmins many of them didn't like the Buddha to ordain their family members because it would take them out of the family group, basically, and they would become monastics. And so Bharadvaja spends some time insulting the Buddha, being very negative towards him in public, in front of the monastics. And after this point, the Buddha sits silently for a short period of time and then says to Bharadvaja, he says, Bharadvaja, do you have friends and neighbors over to your house? And Bharadvaja was sort of startled by that question because he hadn't expected that to be asked, but he says, yes, of course. And the Buddha asks, and when they come over, do you serve them food? And Bharadvaja says, yes, I serve them food. And the Buddha asks, and what happens if, after having eaten their fill, there is still some food left? To whom does that food belong? And Bharadvaja says, well, it's in my house, so it belongs to me. They can leave, and I'll just use this food myself or give it to somebody else, but it belongs to me. And the Buddha says, in the same way, Bharadvaja, I don't accept these arguments of yours, this negativity of yours, this abuse of yours. So given that I don't accept it, it still belongs to you, so you can carry it off with you. So what the Buddha is saying here is that to engage, if the Buddha had engaged with Bharadvaja in abuse and argument, he would have been essentially accepting the food and eating it. But instead, he remains calm, he remains unruffled, he remains untouched by the abuse, which is the equivalent of simply not engaging with this kind of material. So, having not engaged in it, the material simply reverts to Bharadvaja. Bharadvaja can take it away with him if he wishes. And this approach wins over Bharadvaja, and Bharadvaja eventually becomes one of the Buddha's disciples. And I think we can see the brilliance of this kind of technique because it diffuses the anger and enmity that Bharadvaja held for the Buddha. That is to say, by not returning anger with anger, the Buddha was able to defuse the situation. Now this is a great debating strategy, but it also depends upon a very deep kind of psychological understanding on the part of the Buddha, where he was not getting angry in this kind of situation. Now, Matt Diavella talks in his video. He has a person on the video that he was interviewing named Terence Cunningham, who's a singer. And Terence Cunningham talks about how he deals with criticism. And he says that there's two ways to deal with criticism. Either you don't let it affect you at all. So if somebody's critiquing your music style or your artistic chops or whatever it might be, he says either you don't let it affect you at all, or else you do let it affect you and then it can really derail you completely. And Matt's point here is that we all have a choice, that we can choose either to accept criticism or we can choose to let it go, to not accept it. And while I think in the broadest scheme this is absolutely right, there are two ways we can approach this, putting it so bluntly is probably misleading, because for most of us, we don't really have this choice. We're simply presented with our own psychological predilections. That is to say, either we're already psychologically in the right kind of place where we can let the criticism roll off our backs like water off a duck's back, or we simply are presented with a feeling of inadequacy. Now I know in my own case that although I have come a long way since many, many years ago in the ability to accept and deal with criticism, still I absolutely admit that I'm much more perturbed by, let's say, a thumbs down in one of my videos than I am happy with a thumbs up, which is crazy, but it's just the case that somehow it's the criticisms that matter much more than the praise. This is something that I think many of us in the West, and indeed perhaps around the world nowadays, will understand, this kind of hyper vigilance towards criticism, which is not really healthy for us. And I think one of the ways that we can find our way out of that, or at least that can help us to do that, is to begin to inquire where our true happiness lies. That is to say, does our true happiness lie in fame? Does it lie in getting likes? Does it lie in getting lots of thumbs ups and that kind of thing on YouTube, or the equivalent, whatever it is that you do in your own life? Does it lie there, or does it lie somewhere else? Somewhere perhaps deeper than that? And if it lies somewhere deeper, then perhaps we can let the fame go where it will. And if it arrives, then great. And if it doesn't arrive, it doesn't disturb us so much. And I have an earlier video about these roots of happiness and how early Buddhism speaks to that. And I would highly recommend checking it out. I have it right up here on the screen right now. I hope we will catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, all of you, I hope will be well.